Helen Burnet. I'm an alderman of Hobart City Council, and I really welcome you all here tonight to hear the debate on Pokies reform. I'd also like to thank our panel for coming along on such a cold night. It's a really important issue, and I think I won't say anything more, but I'd like just to hand over to Alex Johnston, our MC. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. Yes, my name's Alex Johnston. I'm a journalist, a political journalist with Southern Cross, but I guess I've got a real interest in tonight's forum because there's been plenty of times in my life where I've struggled with gambling and poker machines, and I'm not afraid to admit there are times when they still get me. So it's an issue that shouldn't be ignored, and I think we'll hear some really interesting points of view tonight, and see if we can come up with a few really tangible, practical ways to go forward. It's not about me. I'll sort of just help generate debate, and we'll see how it goes. First of all, I'll let Helen introduce what today's workshop's been about, and each of the panellists will give a quick little introduction. So let's look forward to a robust debate.
Thanks, Alex. This afternoon we had a number of workshops which were really beneficial to talk about the social harms of pokies, but also the economic harms of pokies and what we as a community can do. We hear our politicians, so Andrew Wilkie, Kim Booth in particular in Tasmania, talking about pokies and pokies harm and pokies reform, but quite often I find that our local community isn't engaged or doesn't want to step forward. So it would be really good, and this is certainly what came out of the workshop, if we could, from this evening, but certainly from the workshop this afternoon, actually come away with something positive that we can actually work towards to help motivate our state parliamentarians in making a decision. So I'll just read, a petition was brought to bear from that workshop, and we've also asked Kim to table a motion in State Parliament in relation to this. So I'll just read out what this petition says. Your petitioners request that the House represent all Tasmanians rather than those who profit from pokey losses by firstly implementing a $1 bet limit on all poker machines in Tasmania, giving local governments the power to assess the potential socio-economic impacts of pokey venues operating in their communities before granting a licence to operate, and planning for a pokey-free Tasmania. So those petitions will be going around, and also if you'd like to take some or sign one as you go out, please do, if that represents your feeling. At the local government level, we don't have the opportunity to say where pokies go in our local communities. So I might be able to have more influence over a bottle shop outlet, a liquor outlet in a local community, but certainly not how many pokies go into that local pub. So I reckon it's time that local government had more say, and our state parliamentarians need to hear that.
Kim Booth.
Thanks, Alex. And look, thank you for having me along tonight to talk about pokies and to learn something, which I did today from the forum. I'd like to first of all thank Helen for being so dedicated to this and enthusiastic about organising the forum in the first place and operating as she has been at a local government level for a long time and trying to do something about poker machines and the problems they cause in the community. I totally support the motion that was carried from the floor earlier on there that we should in fact put table legislation, which I commit to do so, to amend the Local Government Act to enable local communities through their councils to have some sort of placement of poker machines, a mechanism which you would think would ordinarily be a right, in fact an obligation of local government in planning legislation that was removed from them under the Gaming Control Act. I think it is of 1995 anyway. It was removed from councils are disempowered when poker machines were rolled out in local communities. Also, Andrew, of course, it's great to be on stage with Andrew. He's been campaigning, very strongly at a national level on poker machines now for some years, and there's no doubt he'll talk about some of the issues and the problems he's got in terms of having the federal government actually stick to their word with regard to pre-commitment. And Stephen Menadue, I want to thank particularly Stephen because he's had the courage as a person who's suffered addiction to poker machines and has been a victim there for many, many years, that he's had the courage to actually stand up and say to people, enough's enough, we've got to stop. We've got to get rid of these poker machines out of the community. They are the crack cocaine of the gaming industry. There's no doubt, there's no question that they are highly destructive machines that damage not only the individual but also our community as well, and the economy. They have profound effects, and it's something as a spokesperson for the Greens that I've come to understand over the years. And until I don't think you could ever feel what Stephen has felt as a victim of one of these machines, but I've come to understand the need at a governance level to do something about it, to actually say that we are going to, as legislators and representatives of the community, remove poker machines from the community, and that has been the Greens' position. We took it to the 2010 election of Poker Free Tasmania policy, which is a policy of the Greens to get rid of poker machines, not only out of the pubs and clubs, but also out of the casinos, because the people who deal with the wreckage of these machines, the people who have to deal with mopping up the broken families, the damaged businesses, the battered wives and so forth, that end up being the end game of the poker addicted family, is just horrendous, and we've got to do something about it. So we've got a commitment to do what the people who do with that wreckage have asked us to do, and that's to get rid of them right out of the whole community. They should never have been here in the first place. We've also got at the moment, we have legislation as part of a harm minimisation approach, because we cannot get support from the major parties, that's Liberal and Labor, to get rid of poker machines. So what we're doing is a staged rollout and a harm minimisation measure with a $1 bet limit, with a couple of other measures to do with the volatility of the machines, the spin rates of the machines, to max out the losses to $120 an hour, which currently in excess of $1,200 an hour. A breadwinner can lose their entire fortnight's wages in less than an hour, just simply wandering into walking down the road a bit depressed, you see the Oasis sign, you think you're going to go in there and receive a bit of relief and succour from the harsh reality of life. And people go into those things and they're deliberately hypnotised. They're hypnotised with the sounds and the smells and the atmosphere that's created there, and they stagger out an hour later having lost their entire fortnight's wages after having been deliberately hypnotised. And we say that's got to end. It's just completely unacceptable that is not only allowed to occur, but is actually given by legislative right to a single company to be able to exploit so many Tasmanians. So we've got that bill currently before the House. In 2009, there was an amendment to the Gaming Control Act, and the maximum bet limit was dropped from $10 to $5. We tried to amend that to a $1 bet limit then, as did the Liberal Party, who moved the same amendment. Now, interestingly enough, and this is politics for you, at a time when the Liberal Party knew that an amendment to limit the bet limit or the losses to the maximum bet limit to $1, when they knew that couldn't pass, they had all the courage of a line to move that. But now that it's a hung parliament, and the same legislation, the same bill before the House will pass, because we have got a $1 bet limit, the Liberals have become decidedly cold over the idea, and I really encourage everybody here to lobby the Liberal Party and say to them it's just unacceptable to demonstrate that absolute cowardice of when you knew you couldn't win putting something up, and when you know you can't win running away from it. So we do have a possibility, if we can get enough pressure in Parliament, to introduce a $1 bet limit, and that will be debated later on this year. Apart from that, I guess I've said enough, but I'd also like to encourage everybody here to be part of this new coalition that has been formed as a result of the workshops earlier today, to make your voices heard, to add to the chorus of people that have been calling out for a long, long time, and they're the agency groups, and I'd like to also thank them, Anglicare, TASCOS, the Stop the Loss Coalition, GamCare, and all sorts of other groups and individuals who are fighting this pernicious plague day in, day out, dealing with the wreckage of these machines. So they need as much support as possible. And if we can possibly get outside of the political parties, a movement that actually says enough is enough and forces the political, politicians of all flavours and colours to do something about pokies, that'd be a great advancement for our community.
Next we'll hear from Andrew Wilkie, who needs little introduction on this issue. It's been his flagship issue. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, Helen and Steve in particular, for organising tonight's event. I think this is a wonderful thing. And it's great that poker machine reform now is a hot topic nationally, and certainly in Tasmania. And the fact that we now have people turning up to these sorts of events, and we do have a genuine groundswell in the community for reform. And I think regardless of what we achieve from here, I think the reform lobby, of which many of you are part of, you have already achieved a great deal, in my opinion, by making the issue of poker machine reform an important national issue that now is discussed around the barbecue. The political parties are now expected to have a policy. They are now expected to justify whatever their policy is and explain themselves. So I think I have an inherently optimistic view of the world, and I think that people like Helen, Kim, Steve have already achieved, and many in the audience have already achieved a great deal. Just to recap where we're at in Canberra, because there are some misunderstandings about where we're at, where we might be going. You would be aware that after the 2010 federal election with the hung parliament, I decided to make poker machine reform one of my flagship issues during my negotiations with Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott. Now, when I went into those negotiations, I took with me the Productivity Commission recommendation for $1 maximum bets. Please understand, that's actually my preferred and has always been my preferred position, and I fully support the Greens campaigning for $1 maximum bets. Regrettably, neither Julia Gillard nor Tony Abbott would agree to $1 maximum bet. It wasn't clear to me at the time exactly why, because it was one of the main recommendations of the Productivity Commission, and it seemed to be a simple, easy to understand solution that a government would be inclined to implement. The value of it was self-evident. You didn't need to wade through hundreds of pages of the Productivity Commission to just see the sense in reducing the maximum bet in some jurisdictions from $10, as much as $10 a spin every 3 seconds, 2-point-something seconds, down to $1. It was self-evident that would, for some gamblers, reduce the amount of losses by 90%. I learned as time went by, though, that the reason both Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott rejected $1 bets was that it is the industry's worst-case scenario, and that industry modelling, poker machine industry modelling, shows that that is the single most significant reform when it comes to impacting on their profits. And James Packer said to me over the phone, he was quite upfront with me, he said it was his nightmare scenario seeing $1 maximum bets implemented in Australia, because it would have the greater impact on his profit than any other reform. So that's what happened with $1 bets back after the election. Now, I think many of you would be aware, and Greg James down there was very aware because he was travelling with me and involved in some of these negotiations, that both Gillard and Abbott turned the conversation to pre-commitment, which was the other key recommendation of the Productivity Commission. And eventually negotiations progressed so far with Julia Gillard that she agreed and put it in writing that if I supported her, the federal government would roll out mandatory pre-commitment across all poker machines in Australia. Most machines by 2014, smaller venues by 2015 was the original agreement, if I recall. Now, pre-commitment is not well understood. Pre-commitment is simply a system where gamblers set, before they start gambling, they set their maximum loss, and when the machine reaches that loss, they are locked out from that machine and surrounding machines for a period of time. The poker machine industry, interestingly, for some time has favoured voluntary pre-commitment, excuse me, which is where pre-commitment is fitted to all machines, but it's voluntary whether you use it or not. In other words, players are able to choose between playing as a registered player with a limit or just playing with cash as an unregistered player with no limit. The reason that the industry favours voluntary pre-commitment is it doesn't work. And now, since I became a Member of Parliament, I've become the Chairman of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Gambling Reform, and we've heard from many witnesses, and it's become abundantly clear that voluntary pre-commitment simply doesn't work. That most problem gamblers will not utilise it. And when I've asked witnesses from the industry repeatedly, show me the evidence that voluntary pre-commitment works, they are unable to show it to me. In fact, their argument for voluntary pre-commitment is it's great for their venue because it won't affect their profits. In other words, it doesn't reduce problem gambling. So the agreement with the Prime Minister was for mandatory pre-commitment, where all players would have to set a limit before they started gambling. To cut a long story short, I think probably most of you are aware of the punchline here. Over a period of 18 months or so, the government and I worked, I thought, cooperatively towards the realisation of that agreement and the implementation of mandatory pre-commitment on all poker machines in Australia. But regrettably, on Sunday the 15th of January this year, here in Hobart, the Prime Minister told me that she would not honour that deal with me. Now that was a very significant thing politically. Is this too long-winded? But it's good to understand the landscape of where we're at in Canberra and how we got there and where we might be going. Significantly, very significant politically, that decision by the Prime Minister, because she is only the Prime Minister in part because she made that agreement with me. But on Saturday, the 15th of January, she said the government was effectively tearing up the agreement for three reasons. One, some testing. She didn't believe she had the numbers on the floor of the House to get it through Parliament. Secondly, there were doubts over the effectiveness of mandatory pre-commitment. And thirdly, that the timeline was too short. Now, I, at the time, and I continue to dispute all three, it is clear to me it wasn't a case that she didn't have the numbers, she didn't want the numbers. And the evidence for that is crucially that the Western Australian Independent, Tony Crook, who was sitting on the crossbench at the time, was not even lobbied for his support. Evidence that they weren't worried about getting the numbers, they weren't worried about not having the numbers. I think she was more worried about getting the numbers and what that would have meant for her personal political survival and the backing of the New South Wales right in particular. Secondly, her query over the effectiveness of mandatory commitment is fiction. There is an abundance of research that it works very well, and in fact, where it has been implemented in Norway, there has been a significant reduction in problem gambling. And thirdly, the timeline was always going to be tight, but the Productivity Commission, in recent evidence to the committee, had assured the committee that the timeline would be difficult but not unachievable. Because the Prime Minister didn't honour the agreement, I did as I said, and I withdrew my support, and I have continued, and my support remains withdrawn until this day. So making me really the most unaligned, or the only unaligned crossbencher in the Federal Parliament, which isn't a bad thing. I don't think that's what in party these days. Well, if you know what I mean. Now, one of the good things that came out of all of that terrible story is that the government did feel obliged or compelled to do something about poker machine reform. And the Prime Minister, at the time the agreement was torn up, she announced what I would call, these aren't her words, what I would call a much watered down package of reforms. When I saw the exposure draft of those at about the time, I decided they were worse than nothing and not worth supporting. Worse than nothing because, despite everything the Prime Minister said in mid-January, when the exposure draft of the bill was made public, Now, I should very quickly explain the watered down reform. It's basically rolling out voluntary pre-commitment over time nationally, doing a trial while doing a trial in the ACT of mandatory pre-commitment, and if the trial in the ACT shows mandatory pre-commitment to work, then it would be up to a future government to consider turning the system from voluntary to mandatory. That's basically the watered down package, the main part of it. But I said I wouldn't support that because the bill did not include any mention of the trial, and it didn't make explicit that the system and machines had to be capable of turning on to mandatory to flick and switch. So over a period of months, I negotiated with the government to see those two amendments made to the bill, and they have now agreed to those two amendments. So now the government's bill legislates the trial, and in particular some important aspects of the trial, that it be independently run and that it must have access to data from New South Wales and other things. And secondly, it's now explicit in the bill that although the machines will be operated as voluntary pre-commitment, they are to be capable of mandatory pre-commitment at the flick of a switch. In other words, if we do find a future government one day of heart and backbone, it won't have to worry about the cost and trouble of mandatory pre-commitment. It can just figuratively flick a switch. So I have decided that the government's bill has gone from worse than nothing to better than nothing, and I have said I will reluctantly support it. But I have warned the government. That if circumstances change and I find myself in a position to push for more meaningful reform, then I will seize that opportunity and I will do it. Because if we don't get something through in this Parliament, who knows when we will. Now, I've been criticised by some people who say I've rolled over. No, I haven't rolled over. I continue to not support the government. I think the government's watered down package is pretty lousy, but it is better than nothing. And frankly, there's something very important going on here in Canberra. So I was the Greens supporter of that, Ken. We will have, for the first time in the country's history, federal intervention in poker machine legislation nationally. Now, currently, poker machines are legislated by states and territories, and there is no federal intervention in that. And because we know that states and territories, with the exception of Western Australia, can't be trusted with poker machines, I think that precedent of getting the federal parliament to start passing laws to interfere in poker machine gambling is very significant. And I think when the history of this is written one day, they'll see that precedent as being a very important precedent, so long as we can get it. So that's where I've reached.
Thanks very much, Andrew Wilkie. And I'll hand over to Stephen Menadue. Stephen probably seems familiar. He's been a really outspoken person, shared his story and put a really human face to this issue. And without further ado, Stephen, go for it.
Thanks, Alex. Is that on? Hello?
Yeah. Let's bring it over.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Steve, and I'll try and be as clear as I can, and sometimes that means that I might just take a bit of a pause. But the short story of my story is that I've spent over 30 years in addiction to poker machines. And in that time, as a result of my desire to get money to gamble, I committed a lot of crime, in which I did over 8 years jail for. And I spent a couple of years in rehab, and obviously being a problem gambler and never having money, I lived, not only did I have all that burden, I had the life of a pauper. No confidence, no self-esteem, nothing like that. I destroyed my family. I lost my son many years ago because of gambling. I have a will that will not let me take my own life. I just can't do that. And so I can tell you this, that if I didn't have that will, there was many times I could count, and not on one hand, that I would have taken my life because of poker machines. And, walking out towards the end of my addiction of over 30 years, I'd walk out the venues just red hot burning tears. Just at the anger at myself having made that same mistake, not even able to fathom how many times I've made that mistake. That's the insanity of it. Like, you know, I've been pretty arrogant in my life, but the people who have suffered the most damage to do with poker machines are people with very rational minds and adjusted lifestyles, and they fall apart. Why do they fall apart? Why does, out of all the types of gambling that a person can choose to take, why do 4 out of 5 of them choose poker machines instead of the horses or any other thing? That's because they're so addictive. And you know, I was under a spell. I was under the spell of irrational thinking. I would do things like my little rituals of, you know, I would say things a certain amount of times that I was going to win. I would put a certain amount of coins in. Like I remember on one occasion where I lived in the north of New South Wales, I had a couple of bucks in the pocket, and I walked for about close to half an hour to go and put that $2 through. And the whole time I'm walking there, to compensate for the fact that I thought I might just lose, I thought, no, I'll win. And I started making a list of things that I was going to buy. It's just dead set madness, as if the jail didn't teach me enough. But all that aside, I've come to a point where I had enough. I had enough gambling, and I was able to see what it was doing to me and the way in which it does it to people and turns them into addicts, the methods I use, and I started to become effective. And like when Andrew came on the scene, that sort of inspired me to stand up and do something about it. But I guess the thing that drives me now, when an addict has a choice, and it's up to them when they stop. No one can help them stop until they're ready to. That part will take care of itself when they put their hand up. But the loved ones and children and family of that addict don't have a choice. They don't go into a poker machine. You know, children probably don't wonder this, but spouses will probably wonder at times why are these machines in my suburb? Why does that publican just quite contentedly keep taking my husband's money, our money? You know, and those children can't come forward because they're scared of embarrassing their loved one. As we know, it's up to them to put their hand up, so you can't out them. That's only going to cause them shame. And like every night, there's children and wives and husbands in this state, you know, going hungry and missing out on other things, but also being psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually affected. Going to bed crying, feeling like there's no hope, and even above the adult's position where they're so badly affected by something that was put in their suburb to take their money on purpose, you've got a child. They become part of an existence that it's a day-to-day thing. It's just an existence. You know, it's not a life. There's not much hope for it. If you can't have school excursions, if you can't have a new bike, if you can't have dinner every night, how can you even start to think about the future?
Thanks very much, sir. Stephen's contribution there is excellent, and he touched on one thing that resonated with me. He said that 4 out of 5 problem gamblers are affected by poker machines, and for what it's worth, I think there are some very simple reasons why people get trapped by poker machines as opposed to other forms of gambling. There's never a break. If you bet on horses, you know, there's a false start or a delay, you know, there's time to stop and check. There's not that with poker machines. And the other thing is, it can happen so quickly. You can call into a poker machine venue on your way home from work and be there such a short amount of time whether you win or lose, that it's very easy to hide from people in your life. You know, I can be, I'm only 15 minutes late, so, oh yeah, sorry, I had a beer at work or something like that. Other forms of gambling are much more obvious to people in your life. So I think they are two practical reasons why poker machines get people in that have a predilection to gambling. I mean, I'm not anti-gambling, but from my experience, it's those really simple, practical things that unfortunately get people in.